introductions, so we have plenty of time for discussion. I'll first say welcome, everybody. It's great to have you here. Kevin, Kumar, and Franklin, thank you for joining us as our panelists today. Looking forward to getting to know you a bit better and hear about your work. I'll also say it's great to see a lot of familiar faces in the call. A lot of our applicants are here who are working on a lot of amazing climate tech and AI solutions. So I'm sure they'll have some great questions for you. So for today's session, we're going to discuss the role of technology in addressing climate risk. As IDEO, we prepared some questions ahead of time. So the first 40 minutes-ish, we're going to have a panel discussion. Franklin, Kumar, and Kevin are going to talk about their experiences with their work around technology and climate resilience. And then the last 15 to 20 minutes will make room for discussion and your questions. So throughout the session, as questions come in, or if you have any questions about the challenge or about what our speakers are talking about, feel free to use the Q&A function on Zoom to start submitting your questions, and we will be curating them and can post them at the end of the session. Let's go to the next slide. I think I already talked over them, but if you need any wayfinding or if you would like to send questions, me and Isha are going to be moderating today. So please, throughout the conversation, send your questions through the Q&A function. You can find it in the menu at the bottom tab of Zoom. Let's go to the next slide. As I said, welcome to our speakers. I don't want to talk too much about you all. I'd rather you talk about yourselves and your work, but I'm going to do really quick introductions. Kumar is joining us from ZestyAI. He's the co-founder and head of product. He manages the product, machine learning, and engineering teams at ZestyAI, an artificial intelligence-enabled climate and property risk analytics platform for the insurance industry. ZestyAI leverages more than 200 plus billion data points on 140 million US properties. Next up, we have Franklin. He's the marketing manager at the global insurance industry at SAS. And I took this directly from your LinkedIn. It said, as a self-described insurance super nerd, Franklin leads the market strategy and engagement for insurance within the global financial services industry marketing team at SAS. He lives SAS's vision to transform a world of data into a world of intelligence. And lastly, we have Kevin, who is the head of Jupiter Intelligence Solution Architecture team. Kevin is an executive with 14 plus years of experience working with insurance, reinsurance, financial services, and energy companies to design, build, and deliver weather and climate solutions. So thank you all for being here. If you our participants go to speaker view, I believe you'll see all of our highlighted speakers throughout the conversation. Before I open with my first question, I just want to talk a little bit about the Climate Resiliency Challenge. If you're here, you're most likely familiar with the challenge, and you've already, I know most of you already submitted ideas, so thank you for being here. As a reminder, we have not even 1 week. By now, we have 5 days left to the end of the open submission period. So if you have any ideas or solutions you're working on that you'd like to submit to the challenge to win a prize, your deadline is July 10th, Monday. Let's go to the next slide. Very quickly, our challenge is focused on how to empower frontline communities to prevent, prepare for, and recover from the most urgent climate-related disasters. Specifically, we're looking at wildfires, floods, and extreme weather, and how we might prevent, prepare for, or recover from them. Let's go to the next slide. As I mentioned, these are our 3 teams. You may be working in just one of these spaces. You may be working across all 3. We welcome any solutions directly focused on climate-related disasters and how to empower frontline communities. Let's go to the next slide. As the last bit of it, we have $1 million that we will be awarding in categories, beginning with emerging innovators. So if you have early stage ideas, you're eligible up to $50,000 in prizes. If you're in mid-stage, you have some type of prototype or pilot, you have a baseline for your idea already. We call this growth stage concepts. You're eligible up to $100,000 in prizes, and then advanced solutions. If you're looking to scale up, you're eligible up to $200,000. So we encourage all of you to submit as soon as possible. As the nature of open innovation, you can endlessly update and add to your solution until July 10th. So if you submit now, IDEO, me and Isha will have a chance to give you feedback. And that's all I have to say. Without further instructions, let's hear from our panelists. So I'll start with the first question, which is, can you tell us a bit more about your organization and your impact in the climate space? Anything you want to share? And I'll put it in the chat as well.
I guess I'll go first. So thank you, Denise, Isha, for having us and having this really timely conversation. So I believe you all saw in the news just a couple of days ago, July 3rd was the hottest day in human history. So climate resilience and the role of technology is certainly a relevant topic. So I work for SAS, or Statistical Analysis System. We were founded over 47 years ago. And today our insurance practice supports 90% of the Fortune 500 insurers and 47 of the top 50 global insurers. And part of the reason I believe we've been around as long as we have a deep commitment to being a good corporate citizen, as well as sustainability and conservation. In fact, like 1,000 yards from where I'm sitting, we have a solar farm to help power one of our buildings. And we use analytics to do the same. And the example I'd share with how we're making a difference with building climate resilience using technology is actually our partnership that was announced on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day with the International Institute for Applied Systems and Analysis, or IIASA, where we combine crowdsourcing and artificial intelligence to quantify the deforestation happening to the Amazon rainforest using computer vision. And since that announcement and that technology was deployed, we've been mapping deforestation with better than 90% accuracy. So really thankful to be a part of this panel and sharing a little bit more about how our work at SAS is impacting the climate space. Thank you.
Happy to go next. My name is Kumar Duvor. I am one of the founders of ZestyAI. Maybe in a short, ZestyAI is a property and climate risk analytics platform for the property and casualty insurance industry. So in short, what we're trying to do is, I think many of you on this forum would be familiar with what a FICO score is, right? That's the score that usually banks use to figure out, how much credit one should get. So an analogy is we are essentially building FICO scores for properties. So we're trying to figure out how resilient a property is to a climate event. So instead of just having one FICO score per person, that's how FICO credit score usually works. In the case of what we are doing, we have multiple such scores. We have a score for wildfire risk, we have a score for hail risk, we have a score for flood risk, wind risk, and so on and so forth, where each score gives you a sense of the likelihood that that particular property will either be in a future climate event, and then also we provide another score where that will tell you how much damage would that property incur if that property does indeed get involved in a climate event. So we're really trying to help. I think Denise, when she framed this, she talked about preparedness, recovery, and resilience, right? I think in that we are much more on the preparedness side. We are trying to provide a sense of understanding to not only insurance companies, but to also homeowners as well, in terms of how vulnerable their properties are. And more importantly, in addition to providing these property scores, we also provide what are the top reasons why a property is vulnerable to a climate event. And our hope in providing that is that homeowners with that data can actually take mitigation steps to make their homes more resilient to those events. And again, thank you, Denise and IDEO, for having ZestyAI in this panel.
Great. And I'll complete this intro with, so I work for, first off, Kevin Shea, and I work for Jupiter Intelligence. We're a physical climate risk provider, and we have an end-to-end climate risk assessment platform. Some of the things that Kumar was mentioning are similar missions to what we do in terms of, being able to provide different insights about, the level of hazard, the amount of damageability, and then an economic impact of different types of assets globally. For Jupiter, the challenge for us is that we have a very high resolution climate data product that is globally consistent. So if you imagine having to do multiple climate assessments around the globe, looking historically, looking at today, and looking at the future, we have very high resolution data. So you can model anywhere on the land surface of the planet, and even some places in the ocean as well, across all these different climate risks. And our customers are utilizing this information in many different ways. Could be a asset owner who needs to understand the different physical climate risk impacts at a particular site. It could be a insurance company who wants to understand the damageability of different properties to be able to calculate impacts on insurance. It could also be a financial services institution who is looking to understand changes in credit risk as a result of climate. At Jupiter, we service a number of different industries. And so we've got a lot of different metrics, outputs, insights that are available to our customers. And with the growing regulatory demand and the amount of different types of regulatory requirements globally, we have to maintain a lot of flexibility. So we have a lot of different metrics and outputs, et cetera. And we've got a great team that I lead, the solutions team, whose primary goal is to help our customers translate this information, these metrics, et cetera, into actionable business impacts and outcomes. And that's a lot of what we focus on and do.
I have so many follow-up questions for all three of you separately. So I'm going to try to ask something broad, and you can take it in the direction that you'd like to talk about. I want to follow up with diving a bit deeper into specific technologies and analytics you each use, and the stakeholders that you work with. So kind of what Kevin was talking about just now, I'd love to hear if there's any examples or specific partnerships or communities you worked with where they were able to leverage your data or analytics or insights to make change happen. So I'll summarize that as, do you have any examples of how your data or analytics have been used to empower frontline communities, whether that's through insurance, reinsurance, directly working with homeowners? Would love to hear a bit more about how you each enable and empower frontline communities towards climate resilience.
I can maybe kick this off and share an example. As I mentioned, right, so Zesty provides property vulnerability scores for a number of different types of perils, and one of the perils that we cover is wildfire risk. We work with a number of institutions, and as you know, in certain pockets, because of wildfire risk, insurance availability and affordability is becoming a challenge, especially in states like California. And one of the advantages of insurance companies working with the scores that Zesty is able to provide is we are able to provide property-specific scores. So what this means is, instead of insurance companies saying, hey, this entire zip code or this entire census block is vulnerable for wildfire risks, I'm not going to write any insurance there, as opposed to doing something like that, they can now make choices at a property by property level, right? They can essentially say, this property is doing all the right things to protect their home from wildfire risk, right? They have the right roof material, they're clearing their surroundings of all kinds of brush and combustible material, and other things that they can do to really improve the resiliency. And therefore, I want to reward that homeowner for good behavior, and therefore I do want to extend affordable insurance to that property, right? And so that's the level of detail we're able to provide. And because of that, one of the insurance companies that we work with, I think Farmers Insurance, they went on record on Wall Street Journal where they talked about how, because of leveraging products that Zesty has created, they're able to insure an additional 30,000 homes that they otherwise would not have been able to insure. So that's like a tangible impact in terms of insurance availability. We also have done a number of projects as well, where we have worked with fire departments in select cities and counties as well, where we have given them access to some of the underlying data that we have, so that if there is a fire event, they can actually use that data to figure out where to staff some of the firefighting officers, which homes to target first, and so on and so forth as well. So a lot of real world impact in addition to just providing the data.
And
oh, go ahead. Why don't you go ahead?
Yep. Sorry, Kevin. I guess I'll go next and share an example on energy forecasting. So one of the things that causes climate change is our use of fossil fuels, right? Burning coal, burning oil, et cetera. And a lot of communities are dependent on these fossil fuels for their energy consumption, powering their homes, their businesses, that type of thing. And one of the things we do at SAS is how you can use machine learning to, say, forecast your solar array placement, incorporate weather patterns, and understand how to maximize your energy production, and then empower those communities to build a path to their decarbonization efforts while minimizing or eliminating the disruption. So I'll give you an example. Say you have a brown asset like a coal plant, right? And it produces so much energy. You've got a 20-year plan to spin down that asset towards solar. Like, can you build a path with your analytics to meet the demand of your community, right? Forecast your energy need while you transition to that green asset, to that solar farm. And that's something that we can do with our analytics. So it simultaneously addresses the root of, hey, I've got this brown asset that's contributing to climate change, right? And I know I need to get to a certain point in the future while making sure my community is able to do basic things like heat their homes, cook food, et cetera. So it's one of the use cases that we have here at SAS. Kevin, sorry to interrupt. I think
no, that's all good.
Jump in here.
It's okay. Yeah, I'll try to give a different example. I mean, we do some of the things that the other two speakers mentioned, but one of the things that we hear a lot about is in reference to supply chain and supply chain impacts. So one of the companies that we work for, that we work with, I should say, is a large pharmaceutical company. And what we've done with them is we've built out their entire supply chain so that they can look at all of their climate impacts by product. So essentially they can say, here are all the different products that we offer. Here's the full supply chain of all the different components that go into making and producing that product. And then they used our data to overlay all of the physical climate risk impacts so that they could say which of their products are most vulnerable to different climate impacts. And they can build certain resiliency plans around that. And they can understand that based on different climate projections, what products are potentially most at risk. So on the corporate side, that's an example of some of the things that we've done with corporate customers. One of the other things that at Jupyter that's a big part of our passion is that there are a lot of areas that don't have the resources to access different climate data. And so we have an initiative called the Jupyter Promise, where we provide either free or nearly free analytics to places that actually need this data and information for certain resiliency decisions. We partnered actually with Fannie Mae to do a couple of inner cities in the United States, where we actually provided city officials with very high resolution climate impact data that's overlaid on top, where they took different data layers and overlaid it on top of our data to figure out where at-risk communities, or where there were at-risk communities that maybe were overexposed to heat risk or flood risk, so they can start planning how to help specific communities be more resilient to these different types of climate perils. So, we're doing things at the corporate level, but we also recognize that there's a lot of need, a lot of areas that can't afford to pay a lot of money for, different climate data. And this is one way for us to give that climate data and get it in the hands of people who can actually do some good with it.
Kevin, you're always hinting right at my next question, which I love. And my next question was going to be, there's a lot of amazing collaboration and work that you do on the corporate level, which is exciting in many ways. And I would love to dive more into the other side that Kevin and you all mentioned, actually, of how do we get the data and analytics to the hands of individuals in the front lines? How might they leverage the data that is complex and big? So the way I phrased it, which I can put in the chat again, was how do you make complex data and or technology approachable and accessible to people who are not in the industry with you? So people who may be homeowners, nonprofits, like firefighters, how, what are some guidelines or even advice you might give or tips on how to make complex data more approachable?
I'll just keep going since I just talked about
Go
two
for
quick
it.
comments, if that's okay. Yeah, so I think this has been one of the biggest challenges when we kind of started our journey as a company. We actually have checked in with a lot of our customers, and they said, what is the one area where they felt like, they needed the most assistance? And they kept coming up with the same phrase that I use a lot now, which is called climate translation, which is, there's so much data that's available, and a lot of it is potentially expensive to produce, some of it not so much. It depends on the granularity, but it's not just about actually physically getting the data, but it's understanding what it is, what the data is telling you, and making sure that you're using it in an appropriate way. So for what we do, using forward-looking climate data, there's obviously a level of uncertainty to it. There's a lot of complexity in terms of like, what are the types of metrics and what are they saying? I remember I had a customer once, and they looked at our flood data and they said, oh, this is great. Flood risk is going down for me. I got nothing to worry about. This facility, like, I'm really good. And then I said, well, hold on. The data is also saying that, like, you're going to see some pretty extreme drought conditions over the next 20 to 30 years. Your facilities are quite reliant on, water intake. Have you thought about how the river channels around your facility are going to decrease, or the water levels are going to decrease over time because of these different drought conditions? And what the impact to your facilities are going to be and to your supply chain, et cetera. And they hadn't even really thought about that, right? So, from anyone that we're talking with, usually the first thing they think about is, hey, what's are we going to see more hurricanes? Are we going to see more flooding? Maybe wildfire is another one, maybe that's top of mind, but they're not thinking about all of the different climate impacts. And so from our perspective, this climate translation, really understanding what the data is telling you is super important. And we haven't found like a concrete way to really make that work other than providing them access to different team members like that we have at Jupiter to really just start understanding and take it slow and make sure that you're on board with a plan where, we don't have to get all the answers right away, but we can start the learning process, we can start the education process, and over time develop a lot of new learnings about what the data is telling you.
Yeah, maybe I'll go next on the approachability. Kevin, I love what you said about making the data and the education available. That's something that we have in common at SAS. We have an education practice where you can try out the technology. We have our own hackathon event where citizen data scientists can engage. On the approachability piece, I'm also a storyteller. So I like telling stories. I like framing my examples up in stories. And making the data and the technology approachable can start with the story that you're trying to tell and the issue that you're trying to solve, right? It gives individuals who may be consuming the data or technology the impetus to be able to say, here's my motivation for doing what I'm doing. And I'm actually going to borrow a quote from the World Health Organization from a article they did a few years ago on the impact of climate change on health and mortality. So by their estimates, the poorest people are largely uninsured, and health shocks and stresses already currently push about 100 million people into poverty each year. And the impact of climate change is only going to worsen that trend. So at its heart, insurance is a noble profession. And to some extent, insurers have always used some sort of technology. But the reason for doing what they do is helping one another, right? That's kind of always been at the heart of our business. So when I think about what we can do to empower those to use that data and technology, it's give them a vision, right? Here's what we're seeking to do. Like, climate change is a systemic risk that seems very, very big at times. But if we can put a story on it, right? If we can, give them some of the motivation to do so. I know that a lot of that stuff is already out there, but for some, connecting the dots between here's the data and technology to ultimately what we're trying to do sometimes takes that story in the middle to tether it together.
Thank you, Franklin. Maybe just build on to what Kevin and Franklin said, right? I think one of the things that we have done from our inception as we develop these property scores is that we made sure that explainability is very important for those scores. So when we provide scores, we just say, hey, what are the top 3 reasons as to why a property got a score, so that if that data is put in the hands of a homeowner, they can now take concrete action. So that's something that most of the regulators in the insurance space are moving towards. Everybody's demanding any kind of risk models be more explainable. So that's kind of how we have always built our products. So in fact, recently, we partnered with a nonprofit that was in the post-disaster rebuilding area, where they would help communities after a disaster, and they would go help rebuild those homes and properties. And they were trying to figure out, hey, why are we always coming into these communities after a disaster and trying to rebuild? Should we be focused more on resiliency, where we can go ahead of the disaster before that and really fortify these homes, right? So we partnered with that nonprofit. We actually gave them access to a lot of our data, so that they can then run models on which communities among the ones that they serve are the ones that are most exposed and most vulnerable, and also the ones where they can actually do meaningful action to improve the resiliency of those communities. So we thought that was a very meaningful way where you're not reacting, but you're more being proactive with data and really improving the lives of people.
Well, I'm gonna continue to build on that. And it's almost like you all had the questions ahead of time. So we're all building on top of each other. But I'm curious, since you all are so much in depth in this space of insurance and technology and climate resilience, what are some of the exciting things you're seeing that are coming out in terms of technology used to prevent, prepare for, or recover from disasters? Is there anything that you're seeing out in the world you're like, oh, this technology could have a great impact? So the way I'm summarizing it in the chat is, what opportunities do you see for the utilization of technologies to build climate resilience? And we've started talking about it a bit, but if there's anything exciting in particular, that would be great to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go first. For me, it's all about the data, and we're at a point in human history where consuming large amounts of data through the data ingestion process, analyzing those data in real time, and deploying models can be done with tremendous speed and efficiency in the cloud, right? I mean, it's becoming very easy, cost-effective, and efficient to run analytics on a real-time basis. And I think Kevin has mentioned this a couple of times, forward-looking analytics, right? And I want to give you an example with the NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. They use a precipitation model called Atlas 14, and it's obsolete. I mean, it's backwards looking, it's used historical data, it does not consider precipitation with the effects of a warming climate, right? And a lot of folks use Atlas 14 for their precipitation forecasts. And Atlas 15 is not going to be ready until like 2026, and that's far too late. But we can go out into the public or private marketplace today, and we can see use cases where cloud computing, machine learning, predictive analytics have been used to build more accurate weather models, to monitor pollution and deforestation, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, and do things that have impacts to climate change, like optimizing energy consumption, and then use those models and that technology to build towards better outcomes. And that in turn is going to lead toward climate resilience. I know everyone's kind of up in arms with ChatGPT and generative AI these days, but that was possible because of the power of computation and cloud storage. And that's only going to further our ability to meaningfully impact these systemic issues.
Yeah,
maybe.
Oh, go ahead, Kumar.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I think data is at the heart of what we do at Zesty as well. So I see a lot of parallels to what just Franklin mentioned. One of the things that we've been able to do, I would say really different compared to what was done before, is take lots of raw data that previously were not analyzed at all because there was no techniques to analyze the data. So such as, what does satellite imagery tell you? What does imagery from aircraft tell you? What can we learn about properties from building permits that homeowners are filing about changes they make to the properties? What can we learn about real estate transaction data that agents are writing about when they sell properties? there is just so much data. A lot of it is unstructured and messy, and you really can't understand it, right? But with the advent of AI, machine learning, deep learning, computer vision, all those type of techniques, you're able to really take all that messy, raw data, unstructured data, and make sense out of it, right? And I think that's what we've been able to do at Zesty. And I think that technology has really enabled what Zesty does today. And I still think the technology is at its infancy. There's a lot of new methods of figuring things out are still coming to the fore. And also the other thing too, right? There are new sensors being developed as well, so that you can capture even more data. Right now, when you capture imagery from the sky, a lot of it is limited to when there is sunlight, but there is new types of sensors available now that you can actually capture 24/7 data. That type of stuff could be quite helpful for certain types of perils. So a lot of exciting innovation happening both in data acquisition, meaning raw data, plus the analytics that applies to transform that raw data into something meaningful that can be helpful for the people.
I'm going to answer the question slightly differently because I would have said the exact same things as the other two speakers. So I'll take the question in a slightly different direction about what opportunities I see to build climate resilience. I think the opportunities are also in the fact that so many companies out there are building climate dedicated teams. And so it's not a specific technology, so to speak. So that's why I'm saying taking the question slightly differently, but it's the fact that so many companies are investing in climate and climate data that's going to make this all possible. So I remember when I first started to do this and talk to customers about climate in like 2017, 2018 timeframe. And I would talk to a company and they wouldn't even know who I should talk to. They're like, climate, like, I think there's someone here that knows science stuff. Like, you should go talk to them. Or you know, a lot of the catastrophe modeling that existed. I used to work in catastrophe modeling. Maybe there's someone on that team that would want to talk to me. Nowadays, you know, you go to a company and they have climate teams, right? They've got vice president of climate, they've got sustainability, they've got all these different people. And so data is super, super important. And I would have answered the question the same way as the other two speakers, but we wouldn't be able to complete the process of actually getting people to utilize the data without the investment from different companies in hiring people in the climate space. The fact that there are people who are dedicated now at these different companies who specifically are there to look at climate and actually utilize the data that's available and incorporate it into business decisions is what's going to make a lot of this possible. And so it's great to see those companies make the investment because, you know, we need companies to be able to mitigate against climate. It's a key part of this. And so having those specialized people at these organizations, people invested in helping those companies solve the climate problem is the other part of this challenge. That's good to see.
I think I'm going to pivot to some of the Q&A questions we're getting from participants because there's some really great follow-up questions. And I'll start with this one from Luisa. Let me see what happens when I say this. Okay, I'm going to post it in the chat. So Luisa asked, do any of the panelists find value in partnering with nonprofits? Can they elaborate on some potential scenarios for network effects?
Yeah, I would highlight one of our current partnerships with the World Wildlife Fund and their conservation efforts. So we recently partnered with them to get at their donor base. As most of you know, and likely all of you know, a lot of 501c3 organizations, they depend on their donor base, fundraising, you know, getting the word out in order to raise funds to do the good work that they do. So when I think about what we should be doing as a good corporate citizen and helping nonprofit organizations, it very much is in line with what we should be doing to fight the good fight on behalf of the planet, right? And those same organizations can utilize their technology to achieve our aligned values and goals. So what the World Wildlife Foundation does, I think I may have said Federation earlier, it's Foundation, is uses our marketing technology actually to market to their donor base, to get their message out, raise funds, and then turn that back into revenue for their organization. I think that our collaboration in that space with nonprofits helps us achieve those mutual goals when we are approaching those things collaboratively.
Yeah, I mean, going back to my Jupyter Promise comments from before, I think everybody at Jupyter has a universal feeling that like we want to be able to utilize this data for good in some way and not just be a company. Obviously there's a financial component to maintaining yourselves as a company. You have to have paying customers, but we want to balance it out, not only helping paying customers, but also help different communities out. So it helps from a number of directions. Number one, you're obviously helping the end customer, and in this case, the nonprofit. But you're also, I think the people that work at a company, it adds morale to employees, the fact that we're utilizing this information, not just as a for-profit entity, which is what Jupyter is, but also, that we're helping people. And that added motivation, I think, helps a lot of people who are at the company do those things because it's super important for them to feel that we're making an impact. I think if you were to poll most employees at Jupyter, that's the thing that they want. That's what I like to do, right? Is we want to make an impact, and we don't just want to do it in the different commercial sectors. We want to be able to do it in the nonprofits as well. So there's a lot of value, and there's also a lot of need, right? So, a lot of the things that we do in Jupyter Promise aren't US focused. We do things in Africa, we do things in Asia, we do things in all over places, because again, they don't have the means in many cases to get access to the type of data that Jupyter offers. So it's super important that we have obviously balance because we want to be able to maintain as a company, but it's also really important for us to be able to get data in the hands of people where they can make an impact, especially in areas where they can't afford it. And so that's why it's a big part of what we do.
Yeah, I think, yeah, exactly for us as well. I think I already talked about the example where, we partnered with a nonprofit that was doing post-disaster work and how we help them think about pre-disaster resiliency. So we think nonprofits are an important part of the solution. I also think even beyond nonprofits too, right? Depending on the product, there is opportunity to work with policymakers as well. So we have embraced that at Zesty. We work with a lot of different policymakers in different states so that, we provide the data that we have to them so that they're making the right policies that actually support, better risk mitigation, better risk transference, better insurance availability. So we're trying to work with both, like Kevin said, right, work with commercial entities because we are a commercial company as well. We need paying customers, but at the same time, with other market participants, whether they are nonprofits, whether they are policymakers, whether they are, just even maybe, public sector entities that are not, very well funded, right? So we try to work with those as well.
I'll continue on this thread because I'm seeing a lot of interest. So we started with talking commercial and corporate, how they utilize data and how you work like in the larger industry space. And we just talked about nonprofits. And then I'm seeing two follow-ups to that. Josh wrote about how you work with government entities. And then in the Q&A, Mira wrote about if you collaborate with utility companies. So the way I'm sort of synthesizing these questions is beyond sort of how data is used in like the bigger industry space, how do some other partners take action based on your data? So like Kumar mentioned, you working with policymakers, what does actually happen when you share your data with policymakers? What happens when you share your data with utility companies or firefighters or nonprofits? I think maybe giving some examples of what happens when data becomes actionable, that would be a great follow-up.
Yeah, so maybe I can kick this off. It really depends on a case-by-case basis in terms of what happens to the data, right? A lot of the time, for startups, I mean, we are a startup as well, right? There are two components to what startups do. One is build really good products and then put those products in the hands of people who would need them and who would find value in them. So the distribution of the products is something that also takes a lot of time. So one of the challenges, and I would love to hear, what Franklin and Kevin say on this as well, is how do you make sure you're distributing these products efficiently to the people in need, right? So a lot of the times, putting data in the hands of startups or policymakers, I think happens more by chance based on, conversations or relationships that, our employees or as founders of the company we have. And, we have taken advantage of those relationships and we have tried to, leverage that data and put it to good use. But it's really hard to make a systematic distribution method for nonprofits or for policymakers, right? Because that isn't like a commercial channel. Even for a startup like us at the scale we are, it is important to be focused on doing things that matter for the company. So for us, it's easier to scale a distribution method towards paying customers. It's a lot harder to scale it towards nonprofits or policymakers. A lot of it has happened by chance. We are very open, right? And we've always welcomed when we do get those opportunities to really go out of our way, understand the use case of how the data would be used, and then depending upon what the entity is trying to do, then we would actually go work with them, right? A lot of the times it's not the same. But the data that a policymaker would need to make better policies is different from what a nonprofit would need to make impact at the local community, right? So I think that the answer is very varied, but I would love to hear my co-panelists' thoughts on how you scale something like that, right? Because it's a very interesting thought, if there is an opportunity to scale something like this.
I'll go next, maybe. Earlier, somebody mentioned about IoT, Internet of Things, like everything throws off a signal these days, right? And how we harness that information. One of the government entities we work with is actually the town where our organization is based, the town of Cary. And they utilize the data coming from IoT devices to track flooding events. Now, why that's important is it helps protect the community. It also helps inform like new development projects. You don't want to build a structure in an area that's going to flood, and it safeguards local watersheds. So we do have that use case, but getting to what Kumar is speaking about, I mean, that use case was born out of relationships. What Kevin had mentioned, people are at the center of everything that we do, right? So we form these relationships, and typically those relationships are going to be formed around our shared interests and the issues that are all affecting us. So I think you need to find the people, and that can be difficult, right? But then you agree upon this is the issue that we're attempting to address, and then you figure out how you can help each other, right? So getting back to why insurance was founded, I mean, there is examples we have of that, are individuals coming together in a shared venture to actually do some good. So it does take time, it takes hard work, but in my opinion, it's the best type of work. So I'm happy to drop the link to the town of Cary example in the chat, but Kevin, I apologize. I think I interrupted you.
No, you're totally good. Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge for companies like Zesty and Jupiter is that anytime you're doing work in the public sector, the sales cycle is really long. There's always a bunch of steps in between you have to go through. And in startup world, we're moving fast, and that doesn't vibe really well with the pace in kind of the public sector sphere. What we have found to be the most effective is to go through partners, because for us, it's really difficult. I think both of you mentioned that it's really existing relationships are the ones that where we do things that are direct. We have a bunch of people that come from government and from research who have existing relationships. So if there's an entity that comes and says, hey, I know Betsy, who's one of the people that works for our company, and hey, I'd love to be able to utilize your data. That type of interaction we can usually do quite quickly and get data in the hands of folks. But when it comes to local municipalities, government agencies, there's an RFP process. There's a lot of work that goes into bidding on it, and those just are very complicated. So what we've done is we've set up a partner network where we work with like management consulting firms, other consulting firms. We work with engineering firms. And so if those entities are more experienced in working in the government sector, that's usually how those entities get our data, because we just don't have the scale as a startup to have to go through a really long process with all these different public entities. So it's a difficult process. I totally recognize a lot of the things that Kumar was saying. The reality is that getting into the public sector requires, I think, a partner network that has experience getting into that sector. And that's usually a faster way to go about the process than, going direct. And really, as I said, just to agree with everybody else, the only direct relationships that we manage to do are ones where we have those pre-existing relationships. So yeah, it's just part of the challenge of working in public sector is it's just a long process.
Thank you. I'm going to continue on this actionable data thread, and I think this is a question for Kumar from Monica. when you were talking about how ZestyAI gives risk scores for homeowners and specific buildings, Monica, feel free to correct me if I am misinterpreting, but Monica wrote, how will your scorecard impact lending or property values? So how does that become immediately impactful to an individual?
Yeah, good question, right? I think I would say the answer is today it doesn't, because we haven't really been focused on the lending sectors as much, right? If you think about properties today, if a property is at risk, the entity that is most responsible for bearing that risk would be the company that has insured that property, right? So that's why a lot of our marketing and outreach efforts have been focused on the insurance industry. We are now seeing that a lot of the financial institutions as well are concerned about it, but not immediately, right? Think about, let's say there is a mortgage provider or a bank that is writing a lot of loans, let's say in a wildfire prone area. So they're not concerned about any single property per se, but they're concerned about what happens if a lot of these loans default because wildfires become rampant there or property values go down there. So it's more like, I think, a second order impact for the lending institutions. So we do think that over time, some of these scores could make their way into how mortgage companies or lending institutions think about property values or think about how they want to lend to these properties. Today, I think we're very early in that cycle. I think it will take some time before they percolate. But more importantly, right, part of the reason why we provide these scores, like I said, right, one is making sure whichever entity needs to understand risk very well, they understand it. But more importantly, I do think that there is an opportunity to make properties more resilient. So we are hoping that the data that comes along with the score, the X, Y, and Z factor that says, hey, if you do this, this, and this to your property, it's actually going to make your property better. We are really hoping that that data also leads to a lot of actionable outcomes.
So Jupiter does a lot of work in this space where we come up with climate adjusted valuation estimates for assets. And Kumar's right. I mean, we're definitely in the early stages with financial institutions. I mean, there's no one way to do this, right? There's no published methodology document that says this is how you evaluate future risks using climate. Certainly there are papers on it and there are things that you can do to look into it. And Jupiter has an approach. And what we've seen is a lot of demand in the financial services space where they're trying to, calculate differences in credit risk based on these asset valuation changes. So, inherently what we've done is we've looked at these forward-looking climate impacts and what, based on the methodologies that we've developed, we say, if there's an asset where, in the commercial space is a great way to think of it, is like, if there's a commercial property where that in the future, that commercial property is going to become less productive and therefore less valuable in the future, that asset actually has a lower value to you today, right? If you know that its power to produce revenue in the future is going to be less, then that the value of it today is going to be less. So what we've done is a lot of these climate adjusted values where we bring in loan information from a lender and we say, okay, this is how much is remaining on a mortgage. This is what the market value of this asset today is. And then we compare that to what a climate adjusted value is. And we can calculate essentially a climate adjusted loan to value ratio to say, hey, this asset, because the value today can be interpreted differently based on future climate impacts, may actually have a different probability of default to the bank. And so we've done a bunch of work. It's very early days, as Kumar said. It's not that any company is writing mortgages or commercial loans based on these metrics. We're not there yet. But what it is providing an additional lens of, what do you expect or what can you expect from this type of property? And, you start building it into that resiliency. I really like what Kumar said about, though, looking at it the other way around, which is not only what is the future a climate adjusted value, but then what different mitigations can you then apply to kind of bring it back the other way? So I really resonate with what Kumar is saying, but there's certainly a demand for it, but it is, again, there's no set methodology out there in the market that says this is the way you got to do it. There are just banks that are looking for these different ways to view their assets to see if they can draw out insights that are different than their competitors. So it's just very, very early days. So I completely agree with Kumar.
Well, thank you. I'm going to continue with the next question, which loops back to when we talked about complex data and how you make that approachable and accessible to everyday people. There's a question here that says, what kind of educational programs do the panelists have? And that can be along the lines of, again, like, how do we make these things actionable, or how do we help people understand what climate risk is?
I may have said this earlier, so at the risk of being repetitive, we give access to Via, our cloud native platform, to learners and educators for free. If you got an email address that has an edu at the end of it, we'll give you access to an environment where you can go in, you can try out these tools. And one of the things that Via does, it's really neat, that being, of course, a technical term, neat. It integrates with open source. So open source is very popular, especially since it's free. It's a way for you to, test your programming chops. You can code in open source. You can code in whatever language that you choose. We call it bring your own language to SAS Via. So it gives those learners and educators access to technology, so you can build your own solutions. And if you wanted to test out those solutions, I think I did mention earlier that we have a hackathon as well, where you can build your own solution. And that's a platform for you to be able to say, here's the issue that I want to address with the technology. And then we go through a global judging process to award those winning solutions who have utilized the technology to address those issues.
Yeah, I mean, Jupiter, this climate translation piece that I mentioned earlier is this educational program. For us, the other thing that we've done, and this is mainly because we've had to work with so many financial institutions, is that a lot of times organizations need to independently validate your data. And especially when you talk about climate data, that's a lot, right? So, I come from a world of catastrophe modeling background where, you'd be able to look at historical events and compare that to output. And if it didn't match, which it usually didn't, there's like, a laundry list of reasons on why, and you have to go through like this validation effort. It's like a different problem here because we're talking about things that could happen in like 2030, 2040, 2050. So like, how do you validate that? And one of the things that we've developed is a model validation program here at Jupiter, where we, through working with some of our early customers, have developed an education and validation program where we give all of the tools to our customers to independently validate our output. It took a lot of work and a lot of input from our customers, but we feel really good that we have a process now where customers can go through and validate that. And that's really important for banks because they actually have these model risk management teams that need to independently validate output before it can be used for business purposes. But it's not limited to just banks because obviously any customer of ours could want to do that on their own. And so the education, it's not just education and learning, but it's also giving them the tools to be able to learn themselves and how to utilize this data, how to validate this data, and be able to independently, as I said, do that without Jupiter's input, although we're certainly here to help them. But those teams need to be able to do it themselves as well. So we provide support for that process, but that was an important thing that we've added as part of our educational program, is to have this validation program because it's really important for them to be able to validate independently.
Yeah, I think for us on the educational front, right, the surprising thing is we have to do a lot of education for the regulators. Insurance, we serve the insurance industry. Insurance is highly regulated at the state level. So, you have to deal with almost 50 different regulators in the US. And especially with these new AI-based climate products, it's very important that regulators actually understand how these products are built. Like I said before, they care a lot about explainability. They also want to make sure that these scores are not discriminatory in nature, right? That they are not using any factors or variables that are considered discriminatory. So there was a lot of work that Zesty as a company had to do, besides building the product, is to really help the regulators understand how the products are built and that they get comfortable that they're being built in an actuarially sound way and that they don't discriminate. That took a lot of work. And given that, our business model is focused on property and casualty. We don't have any broad-based educational programs for the public per se, because we're a B2B company. Our educational outreach has been most focused on regulators, potential customers. And then, like I mentioned, we do provide the data as to why a property score is what it is, and that eventually gets in the hand of the homeowner. But that's pretty straightforward, right? It's not there's no interpretation needed. It's pretty straightforward. We say, hey, your property is high risk for wildfire because you have a lot of vegetation, right? That's pretty understandable. So we didn't have to do too much consumer-focused education per se.
I'll ask a quick follow-up to all of the resources that you're talking about from the Q&A. So there was a question about what is the most community accessible mapping software or sort of public data that people can tap into, if you know of any. Or
Yeah,
there's
not
that's
sure
also a fine answer.
where the questionnaire was coming from, right? I mean, there are lots of software, right? Mapping software. So I'm not sure what the intent behind the question is. A lot of it is open source too, so it's hard for me to pick one per se.
We can definitely ask. Ingrid, would you like to elaborate if you're still here?
Hi. Yeah, I guess I'm thinking about students in high schools. That's sort of my idea, and how, as I'm thinking through this problem, I'm thinking about how to mobilize youth and what is the most egalitarian way to mobilize youth through mapping, as they have the most to gain and lose. They're part of the vulnerable population. They don't vote. They don't own property. They're going to come into the space. How do we prepare them? And how do we use schools as part of a resiliency program in local communities, whether you're using the school as a agrivoltaics hub in rural communities? Like, how do we get the biggest bang for our buck through educating youth, and what mapping software can be used to feed into any of your systems that you're describing, that can actually gather data that helps the resiliency plan? Or am I just way off topic?
Yeah, I think your objective is pretty broad, right? So I think there are lots of aspects to it, but in terms of thinking about a mapping software, nothing directly jumps out. I know, like, for example, Esri is a very strong mapping platform that a lot of open source community use. They also have a paid product as well. And there are others too. I don't know, Franklin and Kevin, if things jump out to you guys.
But we use QGIS here. Pretty much everybody uses QGIS. And that's great because it's free, it's open source, and it does everything that we need.
Right. I'm building off Esri field maps in order to sort of create, like, how much can a school be used to create nature-based solutions and use that property as a kind of a hub for the community in terms of preparing for resiliency.
Maybe one thing I'll mention on a different angle that's maybe a little bit broader than your question around mapping software. I mean, there's a lot of projects, open source documentation that's already out there, and a lot of it is free to the public domain. So think about GitHub. They did just announce maybe like 4 years ago that a lot of their core features are free. And what's interesting about the number of GitHub AI projects over the past 10 years, it's increased from like 1,500 to 350,000. So chances are the problem that you're working on, someone else has started working on it. And that's really kind of the nice thing about these collaborative communities. You can share that knowledge, so you don't have to start from scratch, right? If any of you are writers, I mean, it's the blank page syndrome. Before you write down one word, like, where do you even start? Sometimes going to those project sources and seeing some of that existing documentation can help get you a leg up. So just something to consider as you're starting your work.
I'm going to also add here, Ingrid, that similar areas that you're thinking about, how to get used to be involved in climate resilience, how to utilize technology to empower youth, there's some submissions in the challenge that might be inspiring to you, that you might be able to connect with. And I'm happy to email you some specific submissions, but feel free to browse through the challenge platform as well. And also, if you're thinking about this idea as a submission, I would say that's definitely eligible and related to our topic. So definitely submit your idea. I'll also just mention that we're over time, so I'll stop our discussion here, but thank you so much. This was incredibly insightful. I personally learned a lot and really enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure our participants also appreciated your insights. If from the participants there are any specific questions about the challenge or you want feedback on your idea, please email us at climate resiliency. I'm going to put it in the chat at ideo.com with anything you want support with, or if you submit your idea to the platform in the next 2 days, we will have time to give you direct feedback via comments on the platform. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Franklin, Kumar, and Kevin. This was great, and hope everybody has a great day.